Maria, a bus driver, almost runs over a little girl abandoned in the street and decides to help her. The city stretched out in front of Maria, a mosaic of flickering lights and towering shadows. Her hands, rough from years of hard work, gripped the steering wheel of her bus as she navigated through narrow streets. It was almost midnight, and the usual bustling energy of the metropolis had died down, leaving only the occasional hum of distant cars and the low murmur of her engine. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, clearing the mist from the rain that had just passed. Maria's mind was elsewhere. It often was these days. Her son, Tommy, had been sick for almost 2 years. At first it was just little things. A cough that wouldn't go away, fever spells that came and went. But then the diagnosis came, and her world shattered. He had a rare condition that required a surgery she couldn't afford. Every hour behind the wheel was a desperate attempt to scrape together enough money to save her son's life. She hadn't had a proper rest in weeks, sometimes driving double shifts just to bring in the extra cash. The exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, her eyes heavy but her will strong. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not with Tommy depending on her. As her bus turned the corner of an empty street, her headlights illuminated something in the distance, a shadow darting across the road. Instinctively, she slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, and her heart pounded in her chest. The bus jolted to a stop, and Maria sat frozen, her hands trembling on the wheel. What was that? She whispered to herself, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes scanned the road. In the dim light, something moved. A small figure, barely visible, standing on the edge of the street. Maria squinted, her vision adjusting to the darkness. It was a child, alone. She pulled the bus door open and stepped out into the cool night air, her boots splashing against the wet ground. The child, a girl, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt, and her cheeks streaked with tears. Maria's heart clenched at the sight. "Hey there," Maria said softly, crouching down to the girl's level. "What are you doing out here all by yourself? Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. She stood frozen, her tiny body trembling from the cold. Maria noticed her bare feet caked in mud and the way she clutched a small piece of fabric in her hand. A ribbon, tattered and worn, with the initials ML embroidered in faded gold thread. "Where's your family?" Maria asked, her voice gentle but urgent. "Do you know where you live?" The girl shook her head, her lips quivering. Maria's mind raced. What was this child doing out here? Who was she? There was no one else around, no sign of a parent or guardian, just the empty street and the quiet hum of the city in the distance. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed the story and would love to see a second part, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like to support more stories like this. Your support is what keeps us going. "Come on," Maria said, reaching out her hand. "Let's get you somewhere safe. You must be freezing." The girl hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But after a moment, she took Maria's hand, her small fingers gripping tightly as if she was afraid to let go. Maria led her onto the bus, where the warmth from the heater washed over them. The girl sat quietly in one of the seats, her eyes darting around nervously. Maria sat in the driver's seat, glancing at the girl through the rear-view mirror. She couldn't just leave her here. There was something about this child, something vulnerable, something broken, that stirred a protective instinct deep within Maria. She needed to know more. "Do you have a name?" Maria asked, turning around to face the girl. The girl looked down at the ribbon in her hand, then back up at Maria. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know." The ride back to Maria's small apartment was quiet, the hum of the bus the only sound between them. The girl sat motionless in the seat, her wide eyes staring out into the darkness, her tiny hands still clutching that mysterious ribbon. Maria's mind churned with questions, but the girl remained an enigma, offering no answers to the growing number of concerns racing through Maria's thoughts. When they finally reached the small, run-down building Maria called home, she guided the girl inside. The dimly lit hallways smelled faintly of mildew, and the peeling wallpaper told stories of better days long past. Maria lived on the 3rd floor in a modest apartment that barely held the essentials. The rent was cheap, which was all she could afford. Every penny went towards Tommy's medical expenses. "Here we are," Maria said, as she unlocked the door, trying to keep her tone light despite the knot forming in her stomach. "It's not much, but it's safe. You can stay here until we figure things out." The girl stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the small living room with curiosity. The apartment was tidy but sparse. Just a small couch, an old TV that rarely worked, and a few photos on the walls. One of those photos was of Tommy, back when he was healthy and full of energy. He was 7 in the picture, his smile wide as he held up a soccer ball. That smile had faded in the months since his illness took hold. Maria led the girl to the couch and brought out a blanket from the linen closet. "Here, wrap this around you. You're freezing." The girl took the blanket without a word, draping it over her shoulders. Her eyes were still wide, still filled with fear. Maria wished she knew how to comfort her. But how could she, when she didn't even know what had happened? "Are you hungry?" Maria asked gently. The girl nodded, just barely. Maria moved to the small kitchenette, rummaging through the fridge and pantry. There wasn't much. She hadn't had time for a proper grocery run, but she found a can of soup, heated it up on the stove, and brought it over to the girl. The girl took a few tentative sips, her hands shaking slightly as she held the bowl. She didn't speak, but Maria could tell by the way she devoured the soup that she hadn't eaten in a while. Maria watched her, her heart aching for this lost, silent child. How could anyone abandon someone so vulnerable? After a while, Maria noticed the girl's eyelids drooping, her small body leaning into the couch. She was exhausted. "Why don't you lie down for a bit?" Maria suggested softly. "I'll make a bed for you." The girl nodded and curled up on the couch, pulling the blanket tight around her. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Maria sighed and ran a hand through her hair, her mind still racing. She didn't know what she was going to do. She had to find out who this girl was, where she came from. But for now, all she could do was let her rest. She glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. She should sleep too. She had another early shift in the morning. But just as she was about to turn in, she heard a faint cough from the other room. Tommy. Maria hurried to his side. He was curled up in his bed, his face pale, his breathing shallow. His fever had spiked again. She placed a hand on his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, grabbing a damp cloth and placing it gently on his forehead. "You're going to be okay." Tommy stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. "Mom." I'm here, baby. Go back to sleep." As he drifted off again, Maria sat beside him, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, working all hours, caring for Tommy, now this mysterious girl. She felt like she was being pulled in a million directions, barely holding on. But she didn't have a choice. Tommy needed her. This girl needed her, and she would do whatever it took to make sure they were both safe. The next morning, Maria woke to the sound of laughter. Laughter. It had been so long since she had heard that sound in her home that for a moment she thought she was still dreaming. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the girl sitting on the edge of Tommy's bed, giggling as Tommy made silly faces at her. Maria's heart swelled at the sight. Tommy hadn't smiled like that in weeks. "Well, look at you two," Maria said, smiling as she entered the room. "Seems like you've made a new friend, Tommy." Tommy looked up at his mom, his eyes bright despite his illness. "She's funny, Mom. What's her name?" Maria hesitated, glancing at the girl. "We don't know yet, sweetheart. She's still figuring that out." The girl looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. Tommy didn't seem to mind. He simply grinned and said, "That's okay. You don't need a name to be my friend." Maria watched as the two children played together, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and hope. For a brief moment, everything felt normal, but the reality of their situation lingered in the back of her mind. As the day wore on, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There had been no news reports about a missing child, no police alerts. It was as if the girl had appeared out of nowhere. And that ribbon, those initials, they nagged at Maria like a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. By evening, Maria made up her mind. She would take the girl to the authorities in the morning, see if they could figure out who she was. But until then, she would keep her safe. As she tucked Tommy into bed that night, Maria sat beside him, stroking his hair gently. "You did good today, champ," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." Tommy smiled weakly, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Mom, will I get better?" Maria's throat tightened. She fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Of course you will, sweetheart. You're the strongest boy I know." But as she sat there, watching her son drift off to sleep, Maria couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep up this charade. How much longer she could promise him a future she wasn't sure she could provide. And then there was the girl with no name, no past, a mystery wrapped in fear and silence. Maria didn't know what the future held for her either, but she vowed to protect her, no matter what. Little did Maria know this girl's presence in her life would soon change everything. The next morning arrived with the pale light of dawn creeping through the salines of Maria's small apartment. The girl had slept through the night on the couch, curled up under the blanket Maria had given her. Tommy, too, had a better night than usual. His fever under control for once, thanks to the medication Maria had managed to buy with her extra shifts. Maria, however, had barely slept. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind filled with the unanswered questions surrounding the little girl. Who was she? Why had no one come looking for her? And those initials, ML. They nagged at Maria, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. By the time the girl woke up, Maria had already made up her mind. She would take her to the police station that afternoon, after her shift. They would know what to do. But for now, she needed to focus. Her work was her lifeline, the only thing keeping Tommy's treatment from slipping out of reach. Before leaving for work, Maria knelt in front of the girl, who was still rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Listen, sweetheart," Maria said softly. "I have to go to work for a few hours. Tommy's friend from the building, Mrs. Cruz, will come by and watch you both. I'll be back soon, okay?" The girl nodded, her eyes darting toward Tommy's room. She seemed reluctant to speak, as if something was weighing on her mind. "Is there anything you remember? Anything you want to tell me before I go?" Maria asked gently, hoping for a breakthrough. The girl bit her lip, her fingers toying nervously with the ribbon in her hands. After a long pause, she whispered, "They said not to tell." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "Who said that, sweetie?" The girl's eyes darted to the floor, her voice barely audible. "The men, the ones who took me. They said if I told anyone, they'd hurt my daddy." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Took her? The realization hit her like a wave. This girl hadn't just been lost, she had been kidnapped. Maria's hands trembled as she made her way to the bus depot. Her mind was racing, replaying the girl's words over and over. She knew she should have gone straight to the police, right then and there. But she had no choice. Missing a shift wasn't an option. The money she earned was barely enough to cover Tommy's medical bills as it was. But as she drove her usual route, her thoughts were far from the road ahead. The streets of the city passed by in a blur, the bustling crowds, the honking cars, the neon signs that flickered in the early morning light. None of it registered with Maria. All she could think about was the little girl, the fear in her eyes, and the words she had whispered, "The men who took me." Maria couldn't shake the image of the girl, alone in the dark, running through the streets. How had she escaped? Who were these men? And more importantly, who was her father? The initials on the ribbon, ML. They must mean something, but Maria had no way of knowing what or who they stood for. As the hours dragged on, Maria felt a growing sense of unease. Every time the bus stopped to pick up passengers, her mind wandered back to the girl. What if the men were still looking for her? What if they came back? The thought sent a shiver down Maria's spine. She needed answers, and soon. When her shift finally ended, Maria rushed home, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Cruz, the elderly woman from down the hall, was sitting on the couch with Tommy and the girl when Maria walked through the door. They looked up at her with innocent smiles, but Maria could barely keep her own fear at bay. "Thank you, Mrs. Cruz," Maria said, forcing a smile. "I really appreciate your help." Mrs. Cruz waved her hand dismissively. "No problem, dear. The children were a joy to watch. They played quietly all afternoon." Maria smiled and thanked her again before walking her to the door. Once Mrs. Cruz had left, Maria turned to the girl. "Sweetheart, we need to go somewhere. I have some friends who can help us figure out what happened to you." The girl looked nervous but nodded. Tommy, ever the curious one, piped up from his spot on the couch. "Where are you going, Mom?" Maria knelt in front of him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "I'm taking our friend to get some help, okay? I won't be long. You stay here and rest. Mrs. Cruz will be back if you need anything." Tommy nodded, though Maria could see the worry in his eyes. It broke her heart to leave him, but she knew she had no choice. The police station was a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of Maria's apartment. The cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Maria sat with the girl in a small, sterile waiting area. The walls were lined with posters of missing children, a detail that wasn't lost on Maria. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she thought of the countless parents who had lost their children, the unimaginable pain they must have endured, After what felt like an eternity, a detective approached them. He was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. His badge gleamed in the harsh light as he introduced himself as Detective Ramirez. "How can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm but professional. Maria took a deep breath, her hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. "This little girl. I found her wandering the streets last night. She doesn't know her name, but I think she was kidnapped. She mentioned men who took her, and I think—" Before Maria could finish, Detective Ramirez's expression changed. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the girl, recognition flashing across his face. "Wait a minute," he said, pulling a file from his desk. "What did you say her name was?" Maria shook her head. She doesn't remember. The detective flipped open the file, his brow furrowed. There's been a high-profile missing persons case. A little girl who was taken from a wealthy family about 2 weeks ago. We've been searching for her ever since. Her name is Maddie Langston, the daughter of a prominent businessman. She fits the description perfectly. Maria's heart raced. "Langston? You mean she's the daughter of James Langston, the billionaire?" Detective Ramirez nodded grimly. "That's right. She's been missing for over 2 weeks. Her family's been offering a substantial reward for any information leading to her return." Maria felt the floor drop out from beneath her. This girl, the same one who had stumbled into her life in the dead of night, was the daughter of one of the richest men in the country, and she had been kidnapped. Before Maria could process the shock, Maddie suddenly clutched Maria's hand tightly, her face pale with fear. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go back." Maria's heart sank as she looked down at Maddie. The little girl's face was ashen, her eyes wide with fear. She clung to Maria like a lifeline, shaking her head furiously. "Sweetheart, it's okay," Maria whispered, crouching down to her level. "You're safe now. We're just going to make sure you get back to your family." But Maddie's grip tightened. "No," she cried, her voice rising in panic. "I don't want to go back. They'll take me again." Detective Ramirez stepped forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean, Maddie? Who will take you again?" Maddie's eyes darted around the room as if searching for something or someone that wasn't there. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The men. They said they'd come back for me. They said if I told anyone, they'd hurt Daddy. They'll find me. I know they will." Maria's heart broke at the sight of the terrified little girl in front of her. She'd been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure. But as Maria looked at Detective Ramirez, she could see the wheels turning in his mind. "We need to get her back to her family," he said softly, "but we'll do it quietly, without drawing attention. If what she's saying is true, we could be dealing with a larger operation." Maria nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. Maddie's kidnapping wasn't just a random crime. It was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And now, somehow, Maria was caught in the middle of it. After hours of interviews and paperwork, Maria and Maddie were escorted to a safe house, a modest, secure location provided by the police to keep Maddie hidden until they could ensure her safe return to her father. The house was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall fences and guarded by officers in plain clothes. As they settled into the safe house, Maddie sat on the couch, clutching that same tattered ribbon she had been holding since the night Maria found her. Maria sat beside her, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She was overwhelmed, not just by the events of the day, but by the weight of her own life, her job, Tommy's illness, and now this unexpected twist that had brought her into the orbit of a billionaire's missing child. "What if they come for me again?" Maddie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria took the little girl's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I won't let them, Maddie. I promise. You're safe with me." But even as she said the words, Maria couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. Maddie wasn't just any child. She was the daughter of a powerful man, and power, Maria knew all too well, often came with a heavy price. As the hours passed in the safe house, Maria struggled to process the gravity of the situation. Maddie, still clutching her ribbon, sat silently beside her, occasionally glancing at the window as if expecting the men who took her to burst through at any moment. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall, but the tension between them was palpable. It was nearly dusk when a knock came at the door. Maria's heart leapt into her throat, her pulse quickening. Detective Ramirez stepped inside, his expression serious but calm. Behind him was a man Maria recognized immediately, James Langston, Maddie's father. He looked every bit the powerful man he was rumored to be. Tall and impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his features sharp and chiseled. But beneath that polished exterior, Maria could see the wear of sleepless nights etched into his face. His eyes, blue and piercing, were bloodshot, and his movements lacked the confident energy of a billionaire businessman. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by fear and grief. "Maddie," he whispered, his voice breaking as his eyes locked on his daughter. Maddie's body tensed, but she didn't move. She sat frozen on the couch, her tiny hands still clutching the ribbon, her eyes wide with uncertainty. James took a step forward, dropping to his knees in front of her, his suit creasing in a way that spoke of desperation, not pride. "Sweetheart, it's me. It's Daddy." Maddie's lip trembled, her eyes filling with tears, but instead of running into his arms, she shrank back, her gaze darting nervously between her father and Maria. Maria knelt beside Maddie, her heart breaking for both of them. "It's okay, Maddie," she said softly, resting a hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is your dad. He's here to take you home." James looked up at Maria, his eyes filled with gratitude and an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw. "Thank you for finding her. I thought I'd lost her forever." Maria nodded, though the weight of his gratitude felt strange. She was just a bus driver, an ordinary woman trying to keep her own life from falling apart. She hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. But even as she thought this, she saw the pain in James's eyes, the raw vulnerability that came with nearly losing the most precious person in his life. Maddie was his world, and in some strange twist of fate, Maria had been the one to bring her back. "Maddie," James whispered, reaching out to gently touch his daughter's hand. "Please come home with me. You're safe now." Maddie's lip quivered, and for a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she released the ribbon from her grip and threw her arms around her father's neck, sobbing into his chest. James held her close, his eyes squeezed shut as he cradled her in his arms. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'll never let anyone hurt you again. I promise." Maria stood up, stepping back to give them space, her own heart aching from the raw emotion in the room. She watched as father and daughter clung to each other, both of them broken but somehow beginning to heal in that moment. The police had made arrangements to discreetly return Maddie to her family, but the sense of unease lingered in the air. The threat wasn't over. The men who had taken Maddie were still out there, and if Maddie's fear was any indication, they were dangerous. As James prepared to take Maddie back to his estate, Detective Ramirez pulled Maria aside. "You did an incredible thing finding Maddie," he said, his tone somber. "But I have to be honest with you. We're dealing with something bigger than just a kidnapping. Langston's family has enemies, and it's possible this was more than a ransom grab." Maria frowned, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" "There have been whispers about some kind of organized crime connection," Ramirez continued. "Langston has powerful business rivals. We think someone may have hired professionals to take Maddie as leverage. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control, intimidation. And now that she's back, whoever orchestrated this might not be happy about it." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. She had assumed Maddie's kidnapping had been the work of some desperate criminals looking for a quick payout. But this was something darker, more sinister. She glanced back at James, who was speaking quietly with Maddie, and felt a pang of sympathy for him. He wasn't just a powerful billionaire. He was a father who had nearly lost his child to forces far beyond his control. "So, what happens now?" Maria asked, her voice low. Ramirez hesitated. "We'll keep Maddie under protection for the time being, but we need to keep this quiet. If the people behind this find out she's been returned, they might try to come after her again. Or worse." Maria nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had to protect Maddie, no matter what. But she also had Tommy to think about. His surgery was still looming over her like a dark cloud, and despite all the chaos surrounding Maddie's return, Maria's primary concern was still her son's health. As if reading her mind, Ramirez added, "Langston is grateful to you. He's already asked about your situation, about Tommy. He wants to help." Maria's eyes widened. "Help? How?" "I think he wants to repay you for saving his daughter," Ramirez said. "He's offering to cover Tommy's surgery." Maria's heart stopped. She could barely breathe as the detective's words sank in. After months of working herself to the bone, of sleepless nights and endless worry, the solution to her greatest problem had just fallen into her lap. But even as hope flickered in her chest, doubt crept in. "I didn't save her for a reward," Maria said quietly. I did what anyone would have done." Ramirez smiled faintly. "Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have taken her in. What you did was extraordinary, Maria, and Langston sees that. Let him help you." That night, Maria returned to her apartment, her mind buzzing with a mixture of emotions. Relief, fear, gratitude. It was all swirling inside her, making it hard to think straight. Tommy was already asleep, his small body curled up under the blankets, and Maria stood in the doorway of his room, watching him breathe peacefully. If James Langston really was offering to pay for Tommy's surgery, it would change everything. It would give Tommy the chance he deserved, the chance Maria had been fighting for since the day he was diagnosed. But accepting that kind of help, especially from someone as powerful as Langston, felt like stepping into a world Maria didn't belong in. A world of wealth, privilege, and danger. The next morning, Maria received a call from James's assistant, inviting her to the Langston estate to discuss the details of Tommy's treatment. Maria hesitated before agreeing. She didn't want to involve herself further in the Langstons' world, but the thought of Tommy's surgery being paid for was too tempting to refuse. As she made her way to the Langston estate later that day, Maria was struck by the sheer grandeur of it. The mansion loomed over the landscape, surrounded by manicured gardens and high, wrought-iron gates. The wealth and power that James Langston possessed were palpable, almost intimidating. Maria had never been anywhere like this before, and she felt out of place as she was led inside by one of the estate's staff members. James met her in a lavish sitting room, where the walls were lined with expensive artwork, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. But despite the opulence around them, James seemed focused, his demeanor serious. "Thank you for coming, Maria," he said as she sat down. "I want to talk about how I can help you and your son." Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mr. Langston, I didn't save Maddie because I wanted anything in return. I couldn't leave her out there. She needed help." James smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand, and I admire that about you. But you deserve to be helped too. You've been fighting for your son for a long time, and now that I have my daughter back, I want to do something for you in return." Maria swallowed, her throat dry. "You don't have to do this." "But I want to," James insisted. "I've already spoken with the best doctors. We can arrange for Tommy's surgery as soon as possible. You won't have to worry about a thing." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of what it represented. It was a lifeline, a chance for Tommy to live. But it was also a step into a world Maria had never wanted to be part of. Before she could respond, James leaned forward, his expression darkening. "There's something else you need to know. Maddie told me more about what happened while she was taken. The people who took her, they're not done. They'll come for her again, and they'll come for anyone who stands in their way." Maria's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that by helping Maddie, you've put yourself on their radar, you and your son." The drive home was a blur. Maria's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as her mind raced with the implications of James's warning. The people who had taken Maddie were still out there, and now somehow Maria and Tommy were caught in their crosshairs. What had started as an act of kindness, stopping to help a lost, frightened little girl, had now thrust Maria into a dangerous world of power and crime, a world she had no idea how to navigate. When she reached her apartment, Maria found herself standing outside the door for a moment, taking deep breaths in an attempt to calm the storm inside her. Inside, Tommy was watching TV. Oblivious to the turmoil his mother was facing, Maria had spent months fighting to save her son from his illness. But now, it seemed she was fighting to save him from something far more dangerous. She couldn't let him be caught in this web of crime and conspiracy, but she also couldn't deny the opportunity that had been placed in front of her, the chance for Tommy to have the surgery that would save his life. As she sat beside Tommy on the couch, Maria's heart ached with the weight of the decision she had to make. Could she risk accepting James Langston's help, knowing it might put her and Tommy in danger? Or should she refuse, continuing her desperate struggle to save Tommy on her own? One thing was clear: her life and Tommy's would never be the same. The weight of James Langston's warning sat heavy on Maria's shoulders as the days passed. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, glancing at Tommy's bedroom door, half expecting to see shadows lurking in the hallway. Fear had become her constant companion, though she tried her best to shield Tommy from it. Every time he smiled or laughed, it only reminded her of how fragile their peace truly was. A week after her meeting with James, Maria still hadn't made her decision. The offer to cover Tommy's surgery loomed over her like a beacon of hope and danger all at once. She had contacted the hospital to inquire about the cost of Tommy's surgery again, praying for some miracle that would reduce the enormous fee. But every answer remained the same. Without immediate financial support, Tommy wouldn't make it to the surgery in time. That night, as Maria tucked Tommy into bed, she found herself staring at his small face, pale and frail. His breathing was shallow, and every cough sent her heart into her throat. She couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, she picked up the phone and called James Langston. She didn't bother trying to talk herself out of it anymore. It was a mother's instinct: protect her child at all costs, and that meant accepting James's offer. "Mr. Langston," she began when he answered. Her voice trembled with a mixture of relief and fear. "I'll take your help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before James spoke again. "You're doing the right thing, Maria. I'll have my people arrange everything. The surgery will happen as soon as possible." Maria nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll make sure Tommy is taken care of," James continued. "But you need to be careful. The people who took Maddie are still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to cover their tracks. I've already tightened security at my estate, but I suggest you do the same." Maria swallowed hard. "I understand." "I'll be in touch soon," James added before hanging up. Maria set the phone down, her hand shaking. She had just made a deal with a man who lived in a world she didn't belong to, but the price was worth it, if it meant saving her son. Still, an unsettling feeling gnawed at the edges of her mind. That night, Maria double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her, though the apartment remained eerily quiet. It was as if the threat that James had warned her about was lurking just beyond the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. 2 days later, Maria received a call from the hospital. Everything had been arranged. Tommy's surgery would take place the following week, and the costs had been fully covered by James Langston. It should have been a moment of pure relief, but Maria couldn't shake the nagging fear that had been haunting her. She had barely left the apartment since her conversation with James. Every time she ventured outside, she felt as if someone was watching her, waiting for the right opportunity to approach. Her nerves were on edge, and even simple errands like grocery shopping filled her with paranoia. Every passerby seemed suspicious, every parked car a potential threat. That afternoon, as Maria returned home from the store, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street from her building. It hadn't been there when she left, and though she tried to dismiss it as coincidence, something about the car felt off. The windows were tinted so dark she couldn't see inside, and it hadn't moved in the hour she had been home. Her heart pounded in her chest as she peered out the window, staring at the car with growing dread. What if the men who had taken Maddie were watching her? What if they knew she had helped the girl escape? Maria's thoughts spiraled as she quickly drew the curtains closed. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. Tommy needed her to stay strong, but with the surgery approaching and the tension mounting, she felt like a ticking time bomb. That evening, as she put Tommy to bed, Maria's phone buzzed. It was a message from James Langston. "James, I've arranged extra security for you and Tommy. Please don't worry. You're safe." Maria wanted to believe him, but her instincts told her otherwise. She replied with a simple, "Thank you," and set the phone down, her stomach twisting with unease. If there really were people watching her, What good would security do? The day of Tommy's surgery arrived quicker than Maria had anticipated. She had spent the night awake, pacing her small apartment, running through every possible scenario in her mind. What if something went wrong during the surgery? What if the men watching her made their move while she was at the hospital? But there was no turning back now. The hospital was abuzz with activity when they arrived. Maria held Tommy's hand tightly as they walked through the sterile white hallways toward the operating room. The nurses greeted them warmly, and the doctor, a kind-faced man named Dr. Monroe, assured Maria that everything was ready. "Mrs. Alvarado," Dr. Monroe said as they reached the door to the operating room, "you've made the right decision. Tommy's in good hands. This surgery is the first step toward his full recovery." Maria nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She knelt in front of Tommy, brushing a lock of hair away from his forehead. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom's going to be right here when you wake up." Tommy smiled weakly, his eyes filled with trust and innocence. "I know, Mom. I'm not scared." But Maria was. She watched as the nurses led Tommy through the door, her heart breaking with every step. Once he was inside, Maria collapsed into a chair in the waiting room, her hands trembling as she pressed them together in prayer. The minutes dragged on, stretching into hours, each one filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Monroe emerged from the operating room. His face was calm, reassuring. "The surgery went perfectly," he said with a smile. "Tommy's going to be just fine." Maria's heart soared with relief. Tears streamed down her face as she stood up, hugging the doctor tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." She was led into the recovery room, where Tommy lay peacefully, still asleep from the anesthesia. His face was calm, his breathing steady. For the first time in what felt like years, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. Tommy was going to be okay. He was going to live. But as Maria sat by his bedside, holding his small hand in hers, the shadows of the past weeks lingered in the corners of her mind. Maddie's kidnapping, the men who had taken her, the dark world that James Langston had warned her about. It was all still there, hovering just out of reach, and Maria knew deep down that this fight was far from over. The next few days were a blur of relief and exhaustion as Tommy recovered in the hospital. Maria stayed by his side constantly, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair next to his bed, waking at every little sound he made. Though the doctors assured her that Tommy was on the mend, the relief was bittersweet. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange black sedan parked outside her building, or the cryptic warnings from James. But by the time they returned home, the world seemed to have shifted slightly. Tommy was better, but Maria's nerves were frayed. She had expected to feel a sense of triumph after the surgery, but instead, she felt an even deeper unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound outside the apartment made her jump, and the black sedan was still there. Maria's hands shook as she approached the window, peeking out between the curtains. The car hadn't moved in days. She couldn't see inside, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that someone was watching her. She needed answers. Without thinking, Maria grabbed her phone and dialed James's number. He answered on the first ring. "Maria," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something she couldn't quite place. "How's Tommy?" "He's recovering," Maria replied, her voice tight. "But I think someone's watching us." There's a car parked outside my building. It's been there for days. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Don't do anything, James said finally. I'll handle it. Maria hung up, her heart racing. Whatever was happening, she knew she was in over her head. James's world was one of power, money, and danger. And now, somehow, it had become her world, too. After her conversation with James, Maria couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a life that no longer felt like her own. She sat in her dimly lit apartment, the silence so thick that every creak of the building sent her heart racing. Outside, the black sedan remained a silent sentinel, a reminder that she was being watched. She checked on Tommy, who was resting comfortably in his room. He had bounced back quicker than she expected, already asking when he could go back to school or play outside. Maria smiled faintly at his resilience. His strength gave her hope, but it also filled her with dread. What if this was just the calm before the storm? What if the people who had taken Maddie had shifted their focus to her family? Her thoughts spiraled as she paced the apartment, unable to calm the rising panic in her chest. She couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for something terrible to happen. She needed answers, but more importantly, she needed to feel safe again. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Maria called Detective Ramirez. He had been the one to help her when Maddie had first been found, and she trusted him more than anyone else involved in this dangerous web. "Detective," Maria said, her voice shaking as she spoke, "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What's going on, Maria? Is something wrong?" "There's a car outside my building. It's been parked there for days. I think someone's watching me, watching us." Detective Ramirez's voice became more serious. "I'll send someone to check it out. Don't leave your apartment for now, okay? And keep your doors locked." "Thank you," Maria whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "Please hurry." After hanging up, Maria double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, her stomach twisted with a sense of impending doom. But all she could do was wait. The next morning, Maria was startled awake by the sound of heavy knocking on her front door. She rushed to answer it, her heart hammering in her chest. Standing in the hallway was Detective Ramirez, his expression grim. "We found the car," he said, his voice low. "It was empty, but we ran the plates. The vehicle is registered under a false name. This isn't just some random person parked outside your building, Maria. Whoever they are, they're trying to avoid detection." Maria's blood ran cold. "Do you think it's connected to Maddie's kidnapping?" Ramirez nodded slowly. "It's possible. I've put an unmarked patrol car in the area to keep an eye on things, but you need to be cautious. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, call me immediately." Maria swallowed hard, her fear intensifying. "I can't keep living like this," she said, her voice cracking. "What do these people want?" Ramirez's expression softened. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to do everything I can to protect you and Tommy. We'll figure this out." Before leaving, the detective reminded her again to stay vigilant. As the door closed behind him, Maria slumped against it, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. It was clear now that she had become a target, but the reason why still eluded her. That afternoon, James Langston called. His voice was calm, but Maria could sense the tension beneath it. "Maria, I've spoken to my security team. We're going to increase your protection." Maria was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had never wanted to be pulled into this dangerous world, but now It seemed inevitable. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I'm sending someone to stay with you and Tommy," James explained. "A professional. He'll keep watch over your apartment, make sure no one comes near. You won't have to worry about the car or anyone else who might be watching." Maria's instinct was to refuse. The idea of having a stranger in her home, watching over her and Tommy, felt invasive. But at the same time, she knew she needed help. She had to admit that the added security would bring some peace of mind. "Who is this person?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is David Cross. He's worked for me for years, former military. He's the best I have, and you can trust him." Maria closed her eyes, weighing her options. She didn't want to be indebted to James, but at this point, she couldn't afford to let pride stand in the way of her and Tommy's safety. "Okay," she said finally. "Send him over." "I'll have him there by tonight," James replied. "And Maria, thank you for trusting me." Maria hung up, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she trusted James, or anyone for that matter, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't fight this battle alone. That evening, just as the sun began to set, there was another knock on Maria's door. This time, when she opened it, a tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the hallway. He was dressed in dark, casual clothing, but his stance and sharp eyes betrayed his military background. There was something about him that exuded control and authority, though his expression was calm and composed. "You must be Maria," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm David Cross." Maria nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "James said you'd be coming." David walked into the apartment, his eyes sweeping over the space, assessing every corner, every window, every possible threat. Maria watched him carefully, trying to get a read on him. Despite his intimidating presence, there was something reassuring about his calm demeanor. "I'm here to make sure you and your son are safe," David said, turning back to Maria. "I'll stay out of your way as much as possible, but I'll be keeping watch, inside and outside." Maria shifted nervously, still unsure how she felt about having a bodyguard in her home, but she knew it was necessary. "How long will you be here?" "Until the situation is resolved," David replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "We're not taking any chances." Maria nodded again, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. This was her new reality, a world where hired security and constant surveillance were necessary for survival. It felt foreign, unsettling, but she knew she had no other choice. The first few days with David were awkward, to say the least. Maria wasn't used to having someone in her home who wasn't family, and though David was respectful of her space, his presence was a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just outside. Tommy, on the other hand, was fascinated by David. He asked him endless questions about his time in the military, his adventures, and the people he'd met. David was patient with him, answering his questions with a faint smile and a few carefully chosen words. "He's tough like you," Tommy said one afternoon, looking up at Maria with wide eyes. "You're both like superheroes." Maria smiled weakly, though inside, her heart ached. She didn't feel like a superhero. She felt like a woman in over her head, struggling to keep her son safe from forces she couldn't even fully understand. As the days passed, Maria began to trust David more. He was quiet, professional, and never overstepped his bounds. He slept on the couch, keeping one eye open at all times, and always made sure the apartment was secure before they left for any errands. With him around, The black sedan disappeared. But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still just a step behind them. One night, as Maria was getting ready for bed, she heard a noise outside the apartment, a faint sound, like someone trying to be quiet. Her heart raced, and she rushed into the living room where David was already at the window, peering through the curtains. "Stay back," he whispered, motioning for her to stay in the hallway. He moved with the precision of someone trained for moments like this, slipping through the shadows as if he were part of them. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. There was something primal about the way David moved, calculated, deliberate. He opened the front door quietly, slipping out into the hallway. The silence felt like it lasted forever, each second dragging by as Maria stood frozen in the doorway. Finally, David returned, his expression grim. "There was someone out there," he said, his voice low and tense. "But they're gone now." Maria's heart dropped. "What do you mean someone was out there?" "They were watching the building. Whoever they are, they know where you are." Maria's fear skyrocketed, but David's calm demeanor was unnerving in its steadiness. "What do we do now?" "I've already notified James," David replied. "We're stepping up security, but we need to be prepared. Things are escalating." Maria's mind raced with questions, but there was no time to ask them. All she could do was brace herself for what was coming. The next morning, the atmosphere in the apartment was charged with tension. David was on edge, his sharp gaze constantly scanning the perimeter. Maria felt the anxiety gnawing at her, making it impossible to focus on anything but the growing danger. By midday, there was another knock at the door. This time it was James himself. He stepped into the apartment, his usual calm demeanor overshadowed by something more serious, more urgent. "We have a problem," James said, without preamble. Maria's stomach twisted with dread. "What kind of problem?" James hesitated for a moment, glancing at David before he spoke. "The men who took Maddie, they know you were involved. They've been watching you, waiting for the right time to act. But we've intercepted some of their communications. They're planning something." Maria's blood ran cold. "What are they planning?" James's voice dropped. "I don't know all the details yet, but it's big, and it involves you." Maria's legs felt weak, and she sank onto the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. "I just wanted to help Maddie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," James said gently, stepping closer. "But you're in it now. We both are." David, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. "We need to relocate Maria and Tommy, now." Maria's eyes widened. "Relocate? Where would we go?" James's expression was grim. "Somewhere safe, until this all blows over." Maria couldn't believe how quickly everything was unraveling. In the span of a few hours, her world had turned upside down. By evening, she and Tommy were packing their things, preparing to leave the apartment that had been their home for so many years. "I don't want to go, Mom," Tommy said, his voice trembling as he packed his small suitcase. "Why can't we just stay here?" Maria knelt beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. "I know it's hard, sweetie, but we have to go somewhere safe. It's just for a little while, okay?" Tommy sniffled, but nodded, his small face filled with confusion and sadness. It broke Maria's heart to see him like this, but there was no other choice. David was already at the door, ready to escort them to the safe house that James had arranged. Maria glanced around the apartment one last time, a lump forming in her throat. This place had been their sanctuary, but now it felt like a trap, a place where danger could strike at any moment. As they left, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. But nothing happened. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. David drove them in an unmarked car, navigating through the city with the ease of someone who knew how to avoid being followed. The tension in the car was thick, and Tommy sat silently in the back seat, clutching his stuffed animal tightly. The safe house was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It looked like any other house on the block, with nothing to give away its true purpose. But inside, Maria knew, was a fortress of security measures designed to protect them. As they entered the house, David immediately began setting up surveillance, checking every room, every window, every lock. "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice calm but firm. Maria nodded, though she didn't feel safe. Not really. Not when the people who had taken Maddie were still out there, hunting her down. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She had no idea how long they'd have to stay hidden or what the next move would be. All she knew was that the storm was closing in. The days in the safe house passed slowly, each one filled with an agonizing sense of waiting. Maria kept a close eye on Tommy, trying to make life as normal as possible for him, but she couldn't hide the fear that gnawed at her constantly. One evening, as Maria sat in the small living room staring at the television without really watching it, she received a call from James. "We've made progress," he said, his voice steady, "but this isn't over yet." Maria listened as James explained that the men who had taken Maddie were part of a larger criminal syndicate, one that had ties to powerful figures. They were determined to cover their tracks, and that meant eliminating anyone who could expose them, including Maria. "We're going to take them down," James promised, "but we need more time." Maria's hands trembled as she listened. She didn't want to live in fear anymore. She didn't want Tommy to grow up hiding from shadows, but the fight wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. As she hung up the phone, Maria looked at Tommy, who was playing quietly in the corner of the room. She had done everything she could to protect him, to give him a chance at a better life. But now she needed help. To all those watching, Maria's story wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, about fighting back against the darkness, no matter how overwhelming it seemed. And so, with all the courage she could muster, Maria turned to the camera and made her plea. "Thank you for following our story," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that none of us can fight these battles alone. I've been lucky to have people by my side, people like James, Detective Ramirez, and David. But I need your help too. We all need to stand together in the face of fear and uncertainty." She paused, her heart racing. "If you believe in hope, in the power of kindness, please join us. Subscribe to this channel, share our story, and help us spread the message that no one has to fight alone. Together we can overcome anything." As Maria finished her call to action, she looked at Tommy, who smiled back at her, unaware of the danger that had brought them to this point. Together they would face whatever came next, and they wouldn't be alone.